Welcome to EIR Talks. It's Wednesday, April 28, 1999. This is Tony Pappert. Our subject today is Tony Blair is caught lying. With me in the studio is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg and EIR Law Editor Ed Spanis. Later in the show, we'll be joined by EIR analyst Michelle Steinberg. We'll also get our first look at a top-level Bonn conference keynoted by Lyndon LaRouche on Wednesday, April 21st. Now, each of our guests today was an EIR reporter at the recently concluded NATO April 23rd through 25th summit in Washington, D.C. It's largely thanks to them and the other EIR reporters present that the world now knows that Tony Blair knowingly lied when he was here in the United States. Ed, could you recall for us the days before the summit, why Blair came over so early, what he did, and what happened?
Well, the British press was very open about the reason Blair came early. He was the first NATO leader to come into Washington. He arrived on Wednesday before the Friday that the summit began. And they were proclaiming very loudly that the reason he was coming was to stiffen the resolve of the Americans, to convince Clinton to go for ground troops. And if he couldn't convince Clinton, to convince Congress, to convince the American people that ground troops must be inserted and used in Kosovo and in the conflict, the war, which they don't call it, in Yugoslavia. So what Blair did on the first day he was here, he had a 3-hour meeting with President Clinton. Then he had a meeting on Capitol Hill with congressional leaders. On Thursday, he went to Chicago and gave a speech there in which he enunciated what he called the doctrine of the international community, or what some people quickly dubbed the Blair Doctrine. And his idea there was that NATO, led by the British, with the U.S. in tow, which is his idea, should have the right to intervene anywhere in the world against any regime that doesn't meet the British fancy. In other words, if a regime, to their mind, is violating human rights, is doing ethnic cleansing, all the things which the British have done for decades and centuries. I mean, as LaRouche pointed out, Blair was making the case for bombing Buckingham Palace by these statements he was making, because the British are the most guilty of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of human rights violations.
Minority government.
Exactly. So this is what he did in Chicago. Now, what he was doing throughout this time was saying that President Clinton fully agreed with him and that they were in full agreement. They said it after the meetings, and they said it throughout the weekend. The Washington Post, after the fact, on Monday, had an interesting article on the front page, because what they described, that looking back on the week before the summit began, and of course before we did what we did to expose this, that as leaders were descending on Washington, U.S. officials were worried that the two governments, the UK and the US, as they put it, were not exactly singing from the same sheet. And we know what that sounds like. So the Post reports that senior British officials kept raising the prospect that ground troops would be needed, that Clinton did not want this theme dominating the summit, and that at the 3-hour meeting on Wednesday, according to the Washington Post, Clinton said to Blair, this is not the time to be talking about ground troops. Of course, they did behind the scenes throughout the summit, and everybody knew that that's what was going on. Many of the British press were comparing Blair's mission to the U.S. with that of Margaret Thatcher at the beginning of the Gulf War, when she came and propped up George Bush and said, this is not the time to go wobbly. And the British press was openly saying that this is what Blair was trying to do with Clinton. It obviously was not successful. In fact, it was obvious by the first day of the summit that it was not successful. And when they came out talking about the great unity around the air campaign, I mean, it was patently clear that the reason they were talking about the unity around the air campaign was that there was no unity really on anything, and certainly on the ground troop issue, which was kept, they therefore had officially and publicly to be kept in the background, although it was, in fact, the major topic of discussion at the first part of the summit.
So Blair met with Clinton, tried to persuade him to send in ground troops. He failed, and then he lied to saying that American and British policy were the same.
Exactly.
And the president agreed with him.
Exactly.
Now, Jeff, you were there when this issue broke into the open on Sunday April 25th with British spokesman.
Right. This was now, of course, the third day of the summit, and by this point already, it had been made clear that there would not be a deployment of ground troops. It had been made clear that many of the other things that Blair and company came into town pressing for, including a much broader mandate in the new NATO strategic concept for the world is our stage, if you will, that anywhere on the planet that the British and their American toadies decided there was a need for military action, that it could be accomplished without consulting with the UN Security Council and merely at the drop of a hat. Those ideas were all defeated soundly. And so by Sunday, you have the specter of a sort of a bloodied British delegation trying to put the best face forward. And what happened is that on Saturday, there had been a series of meetings scheduled. There were 2 press conferences announced publicly on NATO television, on all of the bulletin boards by the British delegation, one at 11 o'clock in the morning, one at 3 in the afternoon. They were both canceled at the last minute. There was also to have been a press availability by Tony Blair. That was canceled as well. So basically, on Saturday, the British disappeared from the scene, and it was obviously necessary that sooner or later they were going to have to show their faces. And indeed, on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., there was a press conference scheduled in one of the breakout rooms at the Ronald Reagan Center with Robin Cook, the Foreign Secretary, George Robertson, the Defense Secretary, and Sir General Guthrie, the Chief of Staff of the British military. Shortly into the question and answer period, a reporter for the Washington Times, with whom I had actually been speaking in the press room, comparing notes on some of the developments earlier, and so he was well aware of our evaluation that Blair had gotten a bloody nose, had failed before the summit and failed at the summit. So he got to ask a question, I asked the follow-on, and as you'll see, there was another exchange with EIR reporters later. So why don't we take a look at that clip? First, the Washington Times reporter, and then you'll hear me coming in with a second follow-on question.
Sir, the British were reported to have been more aggressively seeking an okay for the use of ground troops among all of the other NATO members, and that never really hit the public awareness of this summit. What I'd like to know is that behind the scenes, was this issue discussed, and how soon is there expected to be a decision that the NATO bombing campaign has in effect run its course and failed to produce in other words, how many, can you give a timeline where NATO is expected to sit down and actually debate and discuss and decide on the use of ground troops?
Well, I think my first response would be to indignantly rebut the suggestion that Britain is aggressive. To the contrary, Britain is engaged in this action precisely because we wish to restore to the people of Kosovo peace and security in which they can rebuild their shattered lives. On the question of ground troops, all allies are in exactly the same position, that we support what has been said by Javier Solana, and we have invited him to come forward with proposals as to when it would be appropriate for ground troops to go in, to guarantee a ceasefire, to secure the territory, to enable the refugees to go back, but nobody is contemplating doing that in the context of an organized opposition by the Yugoslav army.
Follow-up question?
Very well.
All three of you are actually quoted in the Washington Post today, one would presume accurately. With the, okay, in that case, seeming to suggest that, that at least coming into the summit, the position of the British government was that it was hoped that President Clinton would be convinced to go along with the idea of a broader concept of ground troops coming in before a clear sort of white flag by Milosevic to allow that to happen. Is there an element of frustration in how the whole process of the summit played out on that issue? Or is this inaccurate in terms of what the British government position was, say, Wednesday or Thursday of this week before the summit began?
The British government is entirely happy with the decision that was taken by NATO, announced by the Secretary General, to look and re-review all of the options that were concerned. with ground troops and the implementation force. So that represents our position now, represents our position last Thursday when the announcement was made, and I dare say it will be our position tomorrow when we have the press conference back in London again.
Yeah, but let's get some of your reality check here too. I mean, there are no two closer allies than the United States and Britain. Tony Blair has an excellent close relationship with President Clinton. I speak dearly to Madeleine Albright and work very closely with her. Indeed, yesterday we went for 15 minutes to the BBC, reinforcing each other's messages and demonstrating the similarity both of our analysis and of our common approach. And George Robertson has a very close working relationship with Bill Cohen. All three of us work closely with opposite numbers, and there is not a plain card of difference between us.
Now, just for the record, I was holding up the copy of Sunday's Washington Post, in which indeed there were interviews with Cook, Robertson, and Guthrie. And let me, for the record, read what they said in those interviews, because you'll see that the position that was adopted by the NATO summit, rejecting the idea of ground troops without there being a pre-established agreement with Milosevic, was very different than what the British were pushing going into the meeting. First of all, Sir General Charles Guthrie, the Washington Post describes it this way. Standing on a tarmac at Langley Air Force Base, Britain's Chief of Staff, General Sir Charles Guthrie, spoke Wednesday of the astonishing, quote, velocity of the Serb violence against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo since the war began, and about the limits of the air campaign to effect it. Quote, I am frustrated. I haven't been able to do that, to stop it quicker, he said. So a clear indication from Guthrie. Frustration with the air campaign. Then it continues. Around a dark wooden table, the next day with reporters and editors of the Washington Post, British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook ruminated about a scenario that the Clinton administration dodged all week, sending ground troops into Kosovo without a peace agreement with Milosevic. Quote, a permissive environment certainly would require one in which there was no other functioning army in Kosovo fighting us, he said. Quote, that doesn't necessarily require we have to have permission from Milosevic, unquote. And we'll get to this question of a permissive environment in another few minutes. Then we have, interestingly, British Defense Minister George Robertson, and the Washington Post describes it thusly. In a borrowed aircraft normally used by Vice President Gore, British Defense Minister George Robertson plunged into a similar discussion about the need to win, even if that means changing tactics. Quote, we will need to go in quickly when the circumstances are ripe. He said the 30,000 troops that NATO countries pledged to, quote, implement a peace pact that Belgrade would not sign are no longer enough, he said, and the British are willing to send in more. Parenthetically, the article goes on to note that the Canadian government, a leading nation within the BAC combination, British American Commonwealth Forces, had also gone into the summit pushing the idea of ground troops before a peace agreement is reached. And of course then it notes that there were a number of other NATO countries that disagreed with that formulation. Now, after Robin Cook refused to call on Ed Spanis, who had his hand up for...
That was Ed's voice.
That's right, for the other follow-up.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Right. After that,
no.
he dodged around to other parts of the room, and it was clearly a bad day for the British, because after one question, he then turned to another corner of the room and called on Bill Jones, EIR's White House correspondent. So let's catch a segment of the interchange between Bill Jones and Cook.
In his press conference in Brussels, one of the reporters asked if he were trying to launch a new crusade, and this, of course, has become a theme also in the British press, I understand. And is it not the case that the order is much less cooler, in spite of the fact that people in Europe have been appalled at the ethnic cleansing, that there are very few countries that are willing to go onto this kind of crusade that Prime Minister Blair seems to want to launch?
I have no problem with confirming the ardor of the Prime Minister. He is determined and resolute that we will secure the objectives, both for the sake of the Kosovo refugees, but also because we are fighting for the values of equality, security and democracy for the Kosovo people, and those are the values of NATO. You ask about other supporters. There are 18 other nations in NATO that support us. There are also 7 countries of the region around Serbia who support us. Repeatedly around the rest of the world, when this has been debated in international organizations, the support comes for what we are doing and the criticism comes for what Serbia is doing. We are prepared to see it through. And it is clear from the discussion that we had among the heads of government on Friday that so also are all the allies.
Now, you followed Cook from the room, I understand, after that press conference.
Right. Well, since he didn't want to hear my question inside, I was out in the hall. I noticed that Robertson had come out with a fairly large entourage, and that Cook was not with him. So I waited a few minutes, tape recorder in hand, and shortly thereafter Cook came out. So I fell in next to him walking down the hall, and I asked him about an article that was in the Sunday Times of London that morning, on Sunday morning, April 25th, which that article had described how, well, as I said to Cook, Foreign Minister Cook, I said, the Sunday Times this morning suggests that your Prime Minister came here to rally the American people to do the job that President Clinton wasn't doing. Cook mutters, no, 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 about 6 times, no, 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 no. And I said, shouldn't the American people resent that? And he says, that's totally wrong. And he says, Great Britain and the United States are the closest of allies. Mr. Blair and Mr. Clinton are the closest of friends. So I said, well, then why does he have to come here and appeal to the American people over the head of the president?
Congress, too.
Yeah, and at that point, his security guards, took him away down the hall.
Now, you raised this same question on Friday, the 23rd, with White House spokesman Lockhart.
Right. I asked the question to Lockhart about the British press coverage that Blair had come here. The people had compared it with Thatcher's mission, and it appeared that Blair had not been successful. And this, if you listen to the answer on this, this is Friday, late Friday afternoon on April 23rd. This is the first public definitive statement at the summit of the fact that the Clinton's position had not changed. The British have their position, and President Clinton has his position. So let's listen to that.
Good.
The British press was proclaiming loudly that Tony Blair was coming here to convince President Clinton to introduce ground troops. And in fact, some of the British press, Daily Telegraph, for example, went so far as to compare Blair's mission here with Maggie Thatcher coming and convincing George Bush not to go wobbly on her. I gather he was not successful on the ground troops aspect, but does anybody find this comparison with the Thatcher-Bush comparison a bit insulting?
Well, I'll leave, well, if I got into what was insulting in the press, we'd be here all evening and to have too many areas to go through. I'll leave, let me just tell you what I know, which is the President articulated his position on ground troops well before and many times before Mr. Blair came to visit. He's articulated it since. It hasn't changed. The British have indicated what their position is. I'll let them speak for themselves, and I don't think we should get too caught up in what the latest headlines say, nor should we spend any time worrying about any historical comparisons.
Now, Jeff, the same question came up also Friday the 23rd in the question of what is and is not a permissive environment, quote unquote, in Kosovo. And could you explain this issue for our listeners?
It's quite important because, in fact, the British got a bloody nose before the summit began when President Clinton clearly said, we're not going along with the ground troops. And so the British, being the British, they tried to find some other way to sandwich the same policy in, despite the fact that they had been defeated. And so what they attempted to do was to give the idea that this definition of permissive environment somehow meant something other than an agreement with Milosevic. Now, what happened is that on this issue, Jamie Shea, who is supposedly the spokesman for NATO, revealed himself to be first and foremost a British agent of the same grouping represented by Blair, Cook, and Robertson and Guthrie. In fact, he was asked a question at the Friday regular NATO briefing, he was asked to define this term permissive environment, and you'll see that the definition he gave was identical to the definition that Cook gave in his interview with the Washington Post several days earlier, but it was emphatically not the position that was adopted by the NATO heads of state in their discussions on Friday. They did issue a resolution on Kosovo. The language is very clear. And I think you'll see first with Shea's statement that he's lying through his teeth as per the British profile, and that finally later in the day, when Sandy Berger was asked to clarify, you get the both official position of the U.S. government and, in fact, the position that had been agreed on by all of the NATO heads of state prior to Shea's statement.
Which is that they will not send troops into Kosovo without an agreement with Belgrade.
Precisely, in very plain English. So let's first look at Jamie Shea's formulation, and then we'll come back here, and then we'll go a moment later into Sandy Berger.
Hi, Martha Raddatz from ABC. Can you give us the latest definition for what a permissive environment is, or is it now semi-permissive?
A permissive environment is an environment in which the Serb forces would not be opposing any resistance to an incoming international security force, and in which an international security force would be able to get on with its job of creating a security environment with the least hindrance and with the maximum chances of very rapid success. That definition, of course, is up to NATO leaders. They will know what a permissive environment is when they see it.
Now, again, the formulation by Robin Cook in the Washington Post interview on Thursday afternoon. A permissive environment certainly would require one in which there was no other functioning army in Kosovo fighting us. That doesn't necessarily require we have to have permission from Milosevic. So Jamie Shea, presumably the spokesman for NATO, in fact, is stating the British government's position that was repudiated already by every other country involved in the 19-nation deliberations. And that becomes very clear, again, when Sandy Berger is asked about the same issue later in the same afternoon at his press conference. Let's look at that.
This morning, Jamie Shea was asked to define a permissive environment. And he specifically left out the idea that Milosevic would have to permit the forces in. What he said was that Serb forces would not be presenting any resistance, and that the implementation force would be able to do its job with the least hindrance. And he later said he specifically left out the idea of permission. Now, I know you're saying that this is a hypothetical situation.
I can only speak for American policy, and I don't believe that NATO has spoken formally on this. But in any case, we have indicated that we would participate in a force in a permissive environment. A permissive environment would be one in which the government in Belgrade either would accept its presence or acquiesce to its presence. I think that's pretty straightforward.
So the British are trying to use this as a kind of a slippery slope toward the ground invasion, which they were denied by Clinton in Blair's earlier meetings.
That's right, and in fact, I should say one other thing about that. A number of the reporters with whom we were in pretty regular discussion throughout the course of the summit, naturally comparing notes on various things, but one particular senior French diplomatic correspondent kept coming up to me on Saturday and on Sunday, and this was already after the official communique on Kosovo had been released. And what he said was, why is it that countries are still coming up and saying to me that they're being asked about ground troops, and that the British are still basically taking orders for how many troops various of the second-tier NATO countries are prepared to commit once they finally get the agreement, the acquiescence on the ground troops. So even after the written communique on Kosovo had been finalized, had been ratified by the heads of state, had been released to the press, all of these things that we talked about, the Berger statement, clarification, days later, the British were still running around behind the scenes, trying to convince a bunch of other countries that they would ultimately prevail against everybody else's wishes. So this is the kind of thing that I'm convinced that it was invaluable that we were there, because these are the kinds of details, the actors in play, that gives you a real sense of what this British menace really represents. And I hope it makes the point clear that while many people around the world have been given the false impression, largely courtesy of BBC and Reuters and the Hollinger press, that this whole Balkan war policy was made in Washington. The fact is that it was made in London, and President Clinton was explicit in his opposition to it, and the British simply went about their business trying to ignore all of that and push it through anyway.
Now, you've also remarked, as has Jeff, that the discussion on Saturday was, where is Tony Blair? Where have the British gone? I mean, do you want to fill us in on your summary overview of the summit from that point?
Well, the British came in, Tony Blair, Cook, Robertson, and the whole delegation. This was the war party. These were the warmongers. And as we've said, Blair shows up, the first leader to blow into Washington. You know, we're going to rally the Americans, the dumb, stupid Americans. We're going to rally them behind this policy. It didn't work. It was obvious throughout the summit that it didn't work. And then, in fact, that the Brits had lost on this issue and a number of other issues and were on the defensive. So Saturday, as Jeff mentioned, the second day of the summit, April 24th, there were 2 press conferences scheduled, a press availability with Blair. All were canceled. So one of the big questions of the day was, where's Tony Blair throughout Saturday? It was also a day in which there was intense debate going on the new strategic concept, which was supposed to come out in the morning, and in fact didn't come out until very late in the afternoon. This also involved intense disputes with the British. So Clinton clearly went into this summit with his own policy, and I think what we're seeing here is the beginning of the President Clinton reasserting control over his own administration after a period of well over a year where he was distracted, thrown off balance by the impeachment proceedings, by the scandals, and in which the Principals Committee of Albright, Cohen, Shelton, Gore, Gore's advisor Firth, had essentially taken over U.S. policy, at least to a large extent. Right. In the period leading up to the summit, and I think you'd have to date this from the President's San Francisco speech about 8 days before the opening of the summit, he began to define what amounts to an exit strategy, which is a plan of post-war economic reconstruction, what many people described as a Marshall Plan for Southeast Europe, and that if you're going to solve this problem in any sort of permanent way, rather, it's very easy to get in a war. I mean, as Lyndon LaRouche has said, anybody can start a war. To end the war, to get out of it in a way that you're going to have a durable peace, is something very different. Right. And President Clinton was defining this direction, and this became, as you'll hear in the second half of this program, this became the major focus on the third day of the summit. So the President's policy, as opposed to the British war policy, was to work with the Russians, and this became a very prominent theme of the summit, cooperation with the Russians, also with Ukraine, with other Eastern European countries, but especially with the Russians, to arrive at a political settlement or a diplomatic settlement. And let me just add one point here, which was that I was told by some German journalists, and Jeff picked up elsewhere, on the first day that Cherno Mirdan had wanted to come to the summit, and the British blocked it. He wanted to come on Saturday, and this was blocked. So the focus actually shifted in a significant way from the British war policy into the policy of post-war reconstruction, working with the Russians both to settle the conflict there and then to involve them in the post-war period of reconstruction. So that the British policy, in fact, lost out. And the big lie throughout the entire summit was the British line that we agree we're the best of allies. They agree. In fact, Clinton was in much closer agreement with the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the only people that the British maybe had agreeing with them were some of Clinton's renegade cabinet.
Yes, exactly.
You know, there's a funny other thing. I think you pointed to the San Francisco speech. I
Right.
think there was another moment of real poetic justice in the period just before the summit, because the day before the summit began, President Clinton staged a very grandiose and gracious ceremony at the White House to give a humanitarian award to Helmut Kohl, the former Chancellor of Germany. And of course, every time Clinton and Kohl got together, the British press went berserk over the fact that this was, again, a signal of the end of the special relationship. And I'm sure that the president, in his own kind of funny way, knew exactly that he was twisting a certain knife into Tony Blair and the British by having this grand celebration of Helmut Kohl the day after he met with Blair and said no to the ground war.
You're listening to EIR Talks. The question is, Tony Blair caught lying? And we'll be back in a moment with a question which came up at the NATO summit and was much more fully addressed at an April 21st conference in Bonn, Germany, on post-war reconstruction and stopping the drive for war through reform of the world financial system. Welcome back to EIR Talks. It's Wednesday, April 28th, 1999. This is Tony Pappert, and with me is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg and his wife, EIR analyst Michelle Steinberg. Welcome to the show, Michelle. Welcome back.
Hi, Tony.
We're going to close this broadcast with some initial footage of a very high-level conference which took place in Bonn, Germany on April 21st, keynoted by Lyndon LaRouche. The conference discussed reform of the international monetary system as the only alternative to world war. And participants say it made the other international conferences which are going on nowadays look like babbling. But first, let's return to the NATO summit here in Washington and the concern espoused by governments which opposed the Blair British drive toward war. Michelle Steinberg reported on this aspect of the conference, among others.
Well, Tony, I want to add a very important aspect of what was so crucial about the battle over ground troops, and that was what some government leaders called the empty seat. Russia should have been at this conference. They have been working with the NATO Council for 5-6 years, and they broke diplomatic relations because the British convinced the United States and then dragged the rest of NATO along to begin the air campaign when there was a chance for a diplomatic solution. So the fact that Russian leaders have defined the ground invasion of Kosovo as something that has far-reaching consequences, perhaps a broader war, perhaps a world war, was something that the European leaders understood. Lyndon LaRouche was the first world leader to warn about this, and this is something that we must consider. Now, I did file a report from the conference itself. Let's go to that as an introduction to what the other European leaders, like Mr. Chirac, President Chirac, Prime Minister de Lima, and others were saying. Let's move to that clip now. The Western European NATO allies, especially France and Italy, have been a major impediment to the British call for ground troops during this NATO conference this week. President Chirac gave a very strong and determined call that NATO, the United States, should go back to the UN Security Council and make sure that Russia and China are not excluded from the decisions that NATO will take. This is not what Britain wanted coming into this NATO conference. And Chirac's ideas were immediately echoed by Chancellor Schroeder of West Germany, who has invited both Kofi Annan, the UN General Secretary, and Yeltsin's envoy to Yugoslavia, Viktor Chernomyrdin, to meet him in Germany as soon as possible. These Western European allies are the perfect partners for President Clinton, and you can see that they welcome a lot of bilateral private discussions with President Clinton. The press conference by Prime Minister de Lima made a very important point. He said that the absence of Russia, who had been working rather closely in diplomatic language with NATO for the past several years, the absence from this conference is a painful absence. And and that would hopefully be changed in the near future, because de Lima said Russia now seems to be willing to participate in an international force in Kosovo to guarantee the safety and the safe return of the refugees from Kosovo. This is a moment that is full of possibilities. Which direction will NATO go? It could be the core of a development plan, as President Clinton discussed back in San Francisco a week ago, the core of a Marshall Plan, a type of reconstruction for Southeast Europe and other parts of Europe, including Russia, where it is badly needed. Or, if the British view is taken, it could develop into a widening war. As of this moment, it's clear that France, West Germany, Italy are very, very much interested in the peaceful negotiations. They're in the middle of these negotiations, and this will continue. Tonight, there will be more meetings between President Clinton, Prime Minister de Lima of Italy, Chancellor Schroeder of Germany. We'll find out more about this. This is Michelle Steinberg from the NATO summit meeting on April 25th for EIR. Well, let's go to the end of the NATO summit, because this was really quite a surprising initiative taken by President Clinton. The last session ended in the afternoon, and there were a couple of final events. We had the president say goodbye to the press, all 2,000 or 3,000 of us who were there. And then Sandy Berger gave a brief press conference, and he dropped a bombshell. He announced that President Clinton had spoken to President Yeltsin of Russia for, I think it was, what, 45 minutes?
Right, close to an hour.
Close to an hour discussion, and that Assistant Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, who is the special envoy to the newly independent states and Russia, had already left for Moscow to begin these talks. So now what we have, that was a big shock, and it shows the determination to re-include Russia and to try to undo the damage. It's no small matter to do that. The second aspect, I think it was the last official press conference, was by President Gligorov of Macedonia. And that was a discussion of reconstruction. And what these heads of state from Romania, Macedonia, the surrounding areas are talking about is absolutely beautiful. They say there can't be a peace without rebuilding. And the president of Romania actually pointed out to Bosnia, the shooting and the bombing has ended for a long time, but the building has not begun. I spoke to Chancellor Schroeder at a press conference. I got a chance to ask this directly, and he said, maybe we don't have to use the exact word Marshall Plan, but Europe and the United States will rebuild these areas. So that's how the conference ended, and there's been a flurry, a triangle actually of diplomacy going on between Bonn, Germany, Moscow, Washington, sharing with the other NATO leaders. The British are frozen out, and I hope we keep it that way.
Thank you. Now, Jeff, you filed a summary report from the NATO conference on Sunday. Do you want to give us that summary overview?
Well, I spoke at the very tail end. I think it was probably less than an hour before the concluding session, and tried to indicate where the events at the NATO meeting fit into the bigger picture of the overall priority diplomatic issues that are on the plate of President Clinton, of the continental European leaders. And so the idea was to take the NATO summit and situate it in the bigger picture of the world crisis, the financial crisis, the war danger, both in the Balkans and in many other parts of the world. So why don't we go to a brief segment of my final wrap-up. One would hope that the vigorous debate that characterized the behind closed doors discussions here in Washington this weekend may lead to a broader framework of discussion in which some of the issues that were not addressed here, such as the ongoing and escalating global financial and monetary crisis, the need for this Eurasian land bridge kind of policy orientation to bring real stability to these potential hotspots areas, ideas that the British have hundreds of years of experience in manipulating will be moved forward. I think that the summit has provided at least a check on some of the more ambitious imperial designs coming out of London and some of their allies, and so the opportunity has been posed for an alternative set of policies to be put into play. Lyndon LaRouche has put forward the LaRouche Doctrine as one of the most clearly stated alternatives to what Tony Blair put forward several days ago in Chicago as a Blair Doctrine of a new kind of Anglo-American NATO-flagged imperium. And so that fight will continue and will define world events over the immediate days and weeks ahead. From Washington, D.C., from the Ronald Reagan Building, this is Jeff Steinberg for EIR News. Well, indeed, that is the direction that world affairs are going, and as Michelle will indicate, we didn't quite anticipate it, but some of these broader issues were taken up literally moments later at a meeting down the street in Washington.
Yes, the Democratic Leadership Council had scheduled a meeting as a showcase for Tony Blair, but unexpectedly President Clinton invited himself, German Chancellor Schröder, Italian Prime Minister D'Alema, Dutch Prime Minister Koch, and you reported on that for us, Michelle.
Okay, well, we have some very good clips on that, and I'm going to let those leaders speak for themselves in a moment. I just want to add that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan has already gone to Berlin, where he gave a beautiful speech about development and having Western Europe open the doors for economic development and cooperation to Eastern Europe, Turkey, who wants to be part of the European Union, etc., very much along the lines of Lyndon LaRouche's productive triangle and its spiral arms that EIR talked about. In fact, we have an EIR issue that was called A Marshall Plan for the Balkans that was published in 1996. Let's look at the potential. The discussion is already going on between President Clinton, Schroeder, D'Alema, etc.
Just one aspect, if I may, because I think we might have neglected that aspect a bit. I agree fully with what Wim Kok said and what the American president said as to the need for internal reform. I have just realized how difficult that is. I mean, seen against the background of very specific traditions that my party, that our society has grown used to. There is one aspect that I believe to be very important in this respect. We've been talking about alternatives, and that is the international aspect of politics, of policies, and I think I'm not saying that now with an eye to the United States of America or the countries represented here, but when I look to the countries in the third world and to the newly industrialized countries that tend to be somewhat stronger than the poorest countries in the world, here the international development, the internationalization, globalization of the economies, of the financial markets, create a situation where the political achievements that you have brought about in your own society is being destroyed by these developments. International financial speculators can destroy an economy. We've seen that in Asia, and the consequence of what we've seen there was that the international financial institutions that have to come into play, that is to say the stronger countries have to make their contribution, which they generally do because it is in their very own interest, and that economies are being supported by international financial institutions who pay for the liberties of the speculators in the international markets. One of the causes by the crisis, for example, that has set us back in our economic development. So the internationalization of economies, and we should not try to counter that trend, nor to stop it or to block it. It's something that develops. Information technologies contribute to that, but this internationalization, this globalization of the economies, should it not be followed and accompanied by an internationalization of our policies? When we look to economic policies, for example, and I think that it was last but not least the American president, but it was also others who submitted proposals as to how to cope with the activity activities of these speculators in international financial markets that can destroy a whole economy.
It was difficult to decide to go and fight for Kosovo. We should show the same determination when we decide to pardon the debt of the poorest countries that will never be able to pay back because they're too poor. We should show the same determination and force in taking the decisions that are needed to feed hope. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
That was Prime Minister De Lima of Italy, the second speaker, sounding a theme that, again, President Clinton had raised vis-a-vis Africa. So if we do have Europe, NATO, the United States bringing in Russia and China, fighting with the same ardor for a new economic reconstruction, we can have the kind of long-term peace that Lyndon LaRouche has been talking about and calling for. Now we're going to hear President Clinton use some figures which have been in the pages of EIR over and over again, recognizing that the problem is hot money speculation around the world. Let's go to see President Clinton now.
Let me just say very briefly, I think when we meet in Germany in the next few weeks with the G8, I hope we will ratify a number of changes to the global financial system that I believe will be adopted by the international financial institutions and other bodies that will avoid having another financial crisis like the one we saw in Asia that we have all worked so hard to keep from spreading to Latin America and elsewhere. And it really is a classic third way problem, because what happened was in the last 50 years after World War II, when the so-called Bretton Woods instruments were developed, the IMF, the World Bank, and others designed to promote global trade and global investment. With the explosion of technology and the explosion of trade, more and more money had to move around the world. And then, as always happens, there came an independent market in money unrelated to the trade and investment, so that now every year, every day, there will be about $1.5 trillion in trade per day in goods and services, and the amount of money that moves, $1.5 trillion a day in trade in money, which is roughly 15 times the daily volume of trade in goods and services. And that's the basic problem.
So that was part of a longer speech by Clinton in which he kept coming back to what is the world going to look like once we reach this peace. And we hope that we'll see this in the coming weeks, some dramatic developments. Germany will be holding a conference on the reconstruction of southeastern Europe on May 27th. So we have a few weeks to actually organize that peace. The sooner the better. The British have not given up. They're trying to use the oil embargo question of Yugoslavia the way they use the ground troops and go way out front and try and provoke more animosity with Russia. That's the real target.
Now, we want to conclude this broadcast with an initial short excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche's keynote of a high-level Bonn conference April 21st. LaRouche's presentation was followed by a dialogue in which high-level personalities from Russia, China, and India responded to his proposals. The entire transcript of this conference will be featured in the May 7th issue of EIR.
Any of us who lived through the World War II experience and afterward, who know anything about the history of Tito, the history of Yugoslavia, the history of the Yugoslav military, its training, its capability, its dispositions, knows that what was proposed as a 3-week air war bombing to bring Milosevic to his knees and solve the problem was a piece of insanity. It would never work, and it never will work. Either you were going back to, we're going to land war, we're going to give up, or we're going to have to put the thing back on the table with Russia and other powers to start again to find a political solution. The problem is that the same kind of younger generation which is involved in this financial speculation on the exchanges, which has none of the sense of the old bankers. There's nothing, you find nothing of the Hermann Ab's tradition, or the, shall we say, Alfred Herrhausen tradition, among contemporary bankers who are in positions of power. They're young punks, wild-eyed speculators, who don't know what a real economy is, don't know what real security is. And that's the situation. So therefore, we are now going to what? We are going toward world war. Now, when I say world war, I don't mean a simple world war, relatively speaking, of the type we had in World War I, so-called, or World War II. We have, in the past years, since 1964, but especially since 1971, with the introduction of the floating exchange rate system and other measures of a utopian nature, we have destroyed the ability of the world to produce the kind of material capabilities which might be used for war, with which are used to fight World War I and World War II. Those kind of economic capabilities no longer exist. We live in a world where certain super weapons, like thermonuclear weapons, exist. But no one is capable of winning a war in a classical style, not a serious war. Now, you go back to St. Augustine on this question, on the question of justified war. It is immoral to start a war unless it is necessary to fight the war and unless you can win it. Because if you start a war, which may be justified, which you can't win, what is going to be the result? You're going to get a result like Europe experienced during the middle of the 14th century in the so-called New Dark Age, or the kind of result experienced in Central Europe between 1618 and 1648 in the 30 Years' War, where nobody can win, but nobody knows how to stop the war. Nobody can seem to stop it. When you unleash conflict, when you confront nations and other groups of people with an attack where you offer them no escape to safety, you don't allow them to survive by surrendering on terms under which they can survive, and you push them and you push them, and you fight wars for no good purpose except almost for pleasure, what you create is a doomsday situation of unstoppable spreading wars, much like what happened in Central Europe between 1618 and 1648. So when Russians speak of the danger of war, even nuclear war, they are not exaggerating. Don't think in terms of classical warfare or some model of World War II. Think in terms of the spread of conflict. Think in terms of the process of the disappearance of entire nation states from the political map in Africa. Think of the ongoing process of spreading of the same disintegration of nation states in South and Central America. Mexico so far is holding up. Brazil is threatened next. Brazil will explode if this process continues. Under these conditions, we're creating the possibility of war. Now, the question is, how do you deal with such a situation? Well, we've been pressing in the U.S., I've been pressing as part of my campaign and other activities I do, to get the President of the United States to look at this situation in a new way. He hasn't accepted my ideas about what has to be done on the economy yet, though he's talking in that direction, especially in the past couple of days again. But he made a change recently. There's a change which conforms with what I've said. What he said were three things which are important in a speech in San Francisco as followed up in follow-up speeches later. Number one, that instead of looking at the situation in the Balkans from the standpoint of where is the war going next, ask another question. Where do you go to define the end of the war? How do you bring about the end of the war, not how do you continue it? It's a different approach. It's an approach which any sensible, experienced military strategic specialist would recommend, and some have recommended. Go to the end of war, define what the end of war must be, and start from there to find the solution to bring about the end of war. Right. This involves some problems. First of all, it is impossible to deal with this situation unless we get at it at root. The root of the situation, which started this particular phase of the process with the events of last August through October, when a series of decisions were made to go to hyperinflation, which won't work, and to go to a new strategic policy, which also won't work except to produce chaos. So therefore, unless we remove the starting point of the conflict, we cannot stop the conflict. Now, how do we remove the starting point? Well, it's an obvious way. We have to reorganize the world economy. We have to put the existing bankrupt system, financial system, with its $300 trillion equivalent of unpayable debts and assets, put it through the meat grinder in the same way that we've done before in history, that was done, for example, in Germany at the end of the war in Reconstruction, when new funds were brought in, a new Reich Deutschmark was created, and the operations at the recommendation of Hermann Abs, supported by certain people in the United States, resulted in the establishment of the Kredit für Wiederanstalt. And that became the model of the so-called German economic miracle of the 1960s.
That was an excerpt from LaRouche's opening keynote address to a high-level April 21st conference in Bonn, West Germany. That keynote was followed by responses and discussion, as I mentioned earlier, from top-level personalities from Russia, China, and India. We'll be featuring more, or if possible, the entirety of this conference in future numbers of EIR Talks.